Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive today. It's going to be a really fascinating one, I think.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one.
We're going to be talking about race conversations as they are today, which is obviously a very timely and complex subject.
For sure, for sure.
And the jumping off point that we're using for this is a blog post that I found called Unveiling the Hidden Truth Behind Race Conversations Today. So I think we can all agree that race conversations are important.
Yeah.
But it's also probably fair to say they can be pretty challenging sometimes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this blog post dives right into that.
It does.
It really kind of lays out, like, what are the things that we need to keep in mind as we try to even have these conversations?
Yeah, like what makes them so complex?
Yeah, exactly.
What makes them so hard?
And, one of the things that it starts with is a really interesting historical overview, because I think, often we think about race conversations as like something that is happening right now.
Right.
But there's obviously a huge history that has led up to this point.
A ton of history.
A ton of history. Yeah. So it takes us all the way back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Okay.
Talking about, huge figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and the impact that they had.
Yeah, I mean, those are names that everybody knows.
Right. And for good reason.
Absolutely.
And then it takes us through, landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964,
Sure.
the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right.
All of these moments that were, incredibly hard fought.
Yeah, and we're still dealing with the fallout from some of that stuff.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's not like those things happened and then suddenly everything was equal and perfect, right?
No, definitely not.
There's still so much work to be done. And the post really emphasizes that. But it's like, you can't understand where we are now without understanding that history.
Yeah, and how we got here
Exactly.
and what those pivotal moments were.
And then it moves us into, how the conversation evolved in the 80s and 90s,
Right.
talking about multiculturalism and how, it kind of broadened beyond just black and white.
Right, more voices coming into the mix.
Exactly. And then, bringing us into the 21st century with things like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And it's like each generation has added another layer to this conversation.
Makes sense.
So I think that historical overview is so crucial, and it's something that the blog post really emphasizes. And then it kind of dives into the role that media plays.
Oh, yeah. Media is a huge part of this.
Huge part of it.
How can it not be?
Yeah, both traditional media and social media.
Right.
And it points out that, traditional media outlets like newspapers, television, they have this power to either reinforce harmful stereotypes or
Or they can do the opposite.
they can do the opposite, right?
They can help us break down those stereotypes.
Exactly. And it really comes down to editorial stance and how they choose to frame these issues.
And who they give a platform to.
Yeah, exactly.
Whose voices are being heard.
And then, social media, it's a whole other animal.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because on the one hand, it has this potential to give a platform to voices that have been marginalized.
Yeah. Historically marginalized.
Right. And to share stories and perspectives that we might not have heard otherwise.
And create a more level playing field in a way.
Yeah. Like the potential is there, but then there's the flip side.
There's always a flip side.
Right. The misinformation, the algorithms that often end up promoting divisive content.
Things that are going to get clicks and shares.
Exactly. It's not always promoting what's going to be the most productive conversation.
It's not always about truth and accuracy.
Right. And so it's this really interesting tension between like the potential good of social media and then the very real downsides.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting.
So as you're listening, I'm curious to think about, like, how have you seen media in all of its forms influence these conversations?
That's a good question. I like that.
Yeah, because I think we're all consuming it, whether we realize it or not.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And it's shaping how we think about these things, for sure.
And then the blog post dives into another really important concept, which is intersectionality.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Yeah, so the way that the post explains it is that, race doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Oh,
Right? It intersects with all these other parts of our identity and our experiences.
So it's not just about race in isolation.
Exactly. Like, it's not just about being black or white or Asian or Latino.
It's complicated than that.
It's way more complicated than that.
Okay.
Because you also have to consider things like socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status. All of these things kind of come together.
They'll overlap.
They all overlap.
Okay.
And it uses this really great example of how, like, socioeconomic status can obviously impact anyone's opportunities, right?
Right.
But when you combine poverty with racial bias, the consequences can be even more severe.
Yeah. Because those things are working together against you almost.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's not just about poverty. It talks about how women of color often face like a double burden of discrimination.
Yeah, because they're dealing with sexism and racism at the same time.
Exactly. And then you bring in immigration status and how that can add another layer of complexity, particularly when immigrants are viewed through this racial lens.
Right. So it's like all of these different factors are coming together to create a unique experience for each person.
Exactly. And I think that's what intersectionality is really trying to get at, is like we can't just look at race in isolation.
We have to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, the whole picture.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
So it's a lot to unpack, but it's a really important concept to understand if we want to have truly informed conversations about race.
Yeah, it's like laying the groundwork for a more nuanced understanding.
Exactly. And I think that's what this blog post does so well.
It sounds like it.
It really tries to give us that foundation so we can then have these more productive conversations.
Awesome. I'm ready to dive in.
Me too.
Let's do it.
Okay. And it's not always easy to have these conversations.
No, it's not.
Because there are all these barriers that the blog post identifies that can make it really difficult.
Yeah, like just the fear of saying the wrong thing.
No, absolutely.
Being labeled as racist or making someone uncomfortable.
It's a very real fear.
It is, and it's understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody wants to be seen as like the bad guy
Right.
or to cause harm.
And so sometimes it's easier to just avoid those conversations altogether.
Yeah, just stay silent.
But the post really emphasizes that while fear is understandable, it can also be a huge roadblock.
It can prevent us from having those important conversations.
Exactly. And it's not just fear. There's also sometimes just a lack of understanding
Right.
about, concepts like privilege and systemic oppression.
Yeah. Those can be tough concepts to wrap your head around.
They are. And I think sometimes people feel like they don't have the right vocabulary or the knowledge to even engage in those conversations.
And they can lead to misunderstandings,
Absolutely.
frustration.
So the post talks about, creating safe spaces for dialogue and establishing ground rules so that people feel comfortable sharing their perspectives.
That makes sense.
And it really highlights the importance of education.
Oh, absolutely.
Education is key, when you say.
Absolutely.
Because it can equip us with that historical context that we were talking about earlier.
Right. Gives us the background.
It can expose us to diverse cultural perspective.
Broadens our horizons.
Exactly. And it can give us the vocabulary and the critical thinking skills to really engage thoughtfully.
It's about giving people the tools they need
Yeah, exactly.
to have these conversations in a meaningful way.
And it's not just about formal education, right?
Oh.
It's about being proactive in seeking out information.
Reading diverse voices.
Challenging our own biases.
It's a lifelong process.
It is a lifelong process.
It's not like you just take one class and then you're done.
Exactly.
You're constantly learning and growing.
And the blog post does a really great job of emphasizing the power of personal stories.
Oh, I love that.
Because it's so easy to get caught up in statistics and abstract discussions.
Right. It can feel very impersonal sometimes.
Yeah, but when you hear someone's personal story,
It makes it real.
it makes it real.
It puts a face to the issue.
Exactly. And the post shares a few different stories. One from Maria, a Latina woman, who talks about the duality of cultural pride and experiencing microaggressions.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people of color deal with.
Right, like this constant tension between feeling proud of your heritage and then also having to deal with these subtle but insidious forms of discrimination.
Yeah, it can be hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it.
Exactly. And then there's James, an African-American man whose encounter with campus security highlights the fear and anxiety that people of color can experience in everyday situations.
Just going about their lives.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking to think that something as simple as walking across campus could lead to such a stressful encounter.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
And then there's Aisha, a Muslim woman facing stereotypes and discrimination after 9/11.
Right.
And her story really underscores how historical events can have these long-lasting impacts on individuals based on their race or religion.
And those impacts can be really profound.
They can. And so these stories, while unique, they all emphasize how deeply race can affect someone's life.
And how important it is to listen to those experiences.
Exactly. To really hear what people are saying.
And to learn from them.
And the post doesn't just present these stories, it also provides some strategies for having more productive dialogues.
All ears.
And one of the most important things it emphasizes is active listening.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that term before, but what does it actually mean?
So it's about going beyond just hearing the words that someone is saying
Okay.
and really trying to understand the emotions, the experiences, the perspectives behind those words.
So it's about really being present in the conversation,
Yeah, and putting aside your own thoughts and judgments.
trying to see things from their point of view.
Exactly, and resisting the urge to interrupt.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of that sometimes.
You all are.
It's hard to just listen sometimes.
It is, but it's so important.
It's by asking clarifying questions.
Yeah, to make sure that you're really understanding what they're saying.
Because sometimes we make assumptions.
We do, and those assumptions can get in the way of genuine understanding.
So it's about checking in with the other person.
Yeah, and making sure that you're on the same page.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the blog post also talks about the importance of asking thoughtful, open-ended questions.
Oh, okay. So instead of just like yes or no questions,
Exactly.
get them talking a little bit more.
Yeah, like instead of asking, have you ever experienced racism? You might ask, can you tell me about a time when you felt that your race played a role in how you were treated?
That's a much better question.
Right, because it invites them to share their story.
And to go deeper.
And it shows that you're genuinely interested in understanding their perspective.
Yeah, it creates a space for them to open up.
And the post also acknowledges that these conversations can get uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it's important to recognize that discomfort both in ourselves and in others.
It's okay to feel uncomfortable.
It is, because it means that we're pushing ourselves to think critically.
We're stepping outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. And instead of shutting down or getting defensive when things get tough,
Which is tempting sometimes.
it is very tempting.
Especially if you feel like you're being attacked.
Right. But the post suggests setting some ground rules beforehand.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, like agreeing to speak from a place of respect, even when you disagree.
And reminding ourselves that the goal is to learn from each other.
Yeah, not to win an argument.
That's key, because sometimes it can feel like a battle.
It can. And so those ground rules can really help foster a more open and honest exchange of ideas.
Yeah, I like that.
And speaking of learning, the post circles back to the crucial role education plays.
It keeps coming back to education.
It does, because it's so fundamental.
It's the foundation.
Exactly. And as we were talking about before, it's not just about formal education.
Right. It's about a willingness to learn throughout our lives
Exactly.
and to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's a lot to think about, but I think the blog post does a really good job of laying out the key elements of these conversations.
It's like a roadmap for how to have more productive dialogues about race.
I like that analogy, a roadmap.
Yeah, because it gives us direction.
It does, and I think we all need a little bit of direction when it comes to navigating these complex issues.
For sure.
And I think this deep dive has really highlighted that for me.
Yeah, me too.
It's like we've been given this toolbox filled with knowledge and strategies and personal stories.
And now it's up to us to use those tools to actually build something better.
Exactly, and that building process doesn't have to involve grand gestures or sweeping societal changes.
Right. It starts with the small everyday actions we take.
To contribute to a more inclusive future.
And I think that's something that everyone can do.
Absolutely, regardless of your background or your experiences.
Everyone has a role to play.
Exactly, and the blog post leaves us with this really powerful challenge.
Okay, what is it?
It asks us to make these conversations a regular part of our lives.
Wow, that's a big challenge.
It is, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, because if we're not having these conversations, then nothing's going to change.
Exactly. And so as we wrap up, I want to turn that question back to you.
Okay.
What's one small step you can take today to move us closer to that vision of a more inclusive world?
That's a good question. I think for me, it would be to be more intentional about seeking out diverse perspectives.
That's a great one.
You know, like reading books by authors from different backgrounds, watching movies and TV shows that feature characters from different cultures.
Yeah, exposing yourself to different ways of thinking and being.
Exactly, because I think the more we understand each other's experiences, the more empathy and compassion we can cultivate.
And that's the foundation for a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Wow, that went by fast.
It did. We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
But remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
No, this is just the beginning.
Exactly. Keep learning, keep listening, keep growing.
And keep having those conversations.
Yes. Until next time. It all comes back to education, doesn't it?
It always does.
But it's not just about, like memorizing facts and figures.
No, it's about understanding the why behind those facts.
Exactly. And as the blog post points out, we need to make sure that education, whether it's in schools, universities, or even self-directed learning,
Right.
really gives us the context and the tools to grasp the complexities of race.
Yeah, like teaching history in a way that doesn't shy away from the systemic inequalities
Absolutely.
that have existed and continue to exist.
And making sure that students are exposed to diverse perspectives.
Through literature, art, music, all forms of cultural expression.
Yeah, because ultimately, the more we understand each other's cultures and lived experiences,
The more empathy and understanding we can cultivate.
and that's really the foundation for a more inclusive and equitable society, isn't it?
It is. It's the key.
And I think that's the core message of this blog post, right?
Yeah.
That these conversations about race, they're not a one-time event.
It's an ongoing process.
It is.
It's a journey.
It's a journey that we're all on together.
And it requires a sustained commitment
Absolutely.
from all of us.
A willingness to listen and learn and to challenge our own biases.
To be uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, and this deep dive has really highlighted that for me.
Me too.
It's like we've been given this toolbox filled with all this knowledge and strategies and personal stories.
And now it's up to us to use those tools
To build something better.
to create a better world.
And that building process doesn't have to involve grand gestures or sweeping societal changes.
It starts with small steps
The everyday actions that we take
to make a difference.
to contribute to a more inclusive future.
Exactly.
And the blog post ends with this really powerful challenge.
Okay.
It asks us to make these conversations a regular part of our lives,
To not shy away from them
to lean into the discomfort.
and to keep learning.
So as we wrap up, I want to turn that question back to you. What's one small step that you can take today to move us closer to that vision of a more inclusive world?
That's a good question. I think for me, it would be to have more conversations with people who are different from me.
That's a great one.
People from different backgrounds, different cultures, different walks of life.
Yeah, just to really expand your own understanding of the world.
Exactly. Because I think the more we interact with people who are different from us,
The more we realize that we're not actually that different.
we have more in common than we think.
Absolutely. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Wow, time flies when you're having these important conversations.
It really does. But remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
No. Keep it going.
Keep learning, keep listening, keep growing.
And keep challenging yourselves.
Until next time.